A good vok, Shavua Tov. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be learning with you on a Saturday night. Let's light up the darkness. Before I forget, and I'll announce it again later, there's no class tomorrow night. We'll resume with a double daf on Monday night. I have a conflict tomorrow in the afternoon. Okay, who is with us as we get together to do some learning? That song, by the way, was Forever by Zusha. We're working our way through their album Kavana. Intention. That's what we're talking about tonight. Yehudit in South Carolina, Patrice in Utah, Melissa in Great Neck, Chaim in Charlotte, Bill in mid-Missouri. Everybody take it easy tomorrow, says Bill. The daylight savings change always knocks for a loop. Yeah, that's right. But a little extra sleep, this is better than the spring one. Christo in Lubbock, been looking forward to this all day. Almost the only good thing about Shabbos ending. Amen. Leah in LA, Pauline in Arkansas, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Stephen in New Hampshire. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Ocala, Florida, Lynn in North Texas, Gigi in British Columbia. Tonight's episode of Accidental Talmudist Daily, AT Daily, sponsored by Michael and Jeannie Schechter for the healing of Jonathan S., who had a surgery and is in recovery. May he have a refuah shlema. May we only hear good news. Michael and Jeannie, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We thank you for enabling us to reach more people with more Torah in the world. And we say Amen. We are holding by page 28 here in Tractate Rosh Hashana, the 9th volume of the Talmud. This tractate has 35 pages, so we are almost at the end. We're in chapter 3, continuing our discussion today of Mishna number 4. The Mishna was regarding a shofar that cracked or was repaired or was cut. And we're generally studying what makes it a kosher shofar. If you cut off too much of the shofar, it will no longer be a kosher shofar. But you can have a very small shofar, it just has to stick out on both sides of your fist, and then it would be a kosher shofar. So if we cut off all of this, it would still be a kosher shofar. Very high-pitched shofar, I believe, in that case. And then we're getting into some further circumstances of hearing the shofar and blasting the shofar, which would qualify for somebody to fulfill his obligation to hear the shofar on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashana and have fulfilled their obligation. So we pick this up a few paragraphs down from the top of the A side of page 28. Rav Yehuda said, one should not blow with the shofar of an animal consecrated as a burnt offering. But if he nevertheless transgressed and he blew such a shofar, he has fulfilled his obligation. On the other hand, one should also not blow with the shofar of an animal consecrated as a peace offering, and if he nevertheless transgressed and blew, he has not fulfilled his obligation. So we see two cases here. The general rule is when the temple is standing and an animal is consecrated to be a sacrificial animal, a burnt offering or a peace offering in this case, you should not use the horn of such an animal as a shofar. But if you did, right, so ab initio, you should not do such a thing. But if you did it anyway, you transgressed at the minimum a rabbinic decree that you should not do that. I assume if you transgressed, it's not a total, well, we're going to be discussing this. So ab initio, you should not do that. But if you did it, if the animal was a burnt offering, then that shofar blast is still a kosher shofar blast, and one who hears it has fulfilled his obligation. But if it was a peace offering, no. So what's the difference? A burnt offering is an offering that is burnt up entirely on the altar. And a peace offering is one which only a few select parts of the animal go up in smoke on the altar as a pleasing aroma to Hashem. But the rest of it, most of it is actually the property of the owners, and they will eat it during the festival. So we saw that these shalamim, these peace offerings, would accompany, for example, the Passover, the Paschal offering, the Pesach. And it made sense because a lot of people were registered maybe to one little lamb to get their bit of meat from the Paschal lamb, but then they wouldn't have had a satisfying, festival meal the night of the Seder. And so there were these additional offerings, and those are the shalamim, the peace offerings. Now, why is it that the horn from the burnt offering, even though you shouldn't use it, if you did use it, it still counts, and the horn from the peace offering, you shouldn't use it, but if you did use it, it doesn't count? And the Gemara explains, what is the reason for this distinction? A burnt offering is subject to misuse of consecrated objects before being offered. And once one misuses it for mundane purposes, it becomes non-sacred, so that the one who blows with its shofar fulfills his obligation. In contrast, peace offerings are not subject to misuse of consecrated objects before being offered. Since in the case of sacrifices of lesser sanctity, a peace offering is considered lesser sanctity than a burnt offering, and an elevation offering. Misuse is restricted to the fats and other portions that are offered on the altar. And even this applies only after the sprinkling of the blood. Since one is not considered to be misusing peace offerings when utilizing them for mundane purposes, the prohibition remains intact and they do not become non-sacred. Therefore, one who blows the shofar of an animal consecrated as a peace offering does not fulfill his obligation. Now, there's a lot of technicalities here, but the general idea is an animal that's been consecrated, you can't use it for mundane purposes, right? Once you consecrate, let's say, a bull for an offering in the temple, you couldn't then use it to pull your plow in your field. It's been consecrated. But the rules of misuse have a lot of nuances, and we'll be discussing a lot more about them when we get into the laws of offerings. But this idea that exactly what kind of misuse are you doing, and then what is the consequence of that misuse, right? So the misuse in the case of the burnt offering, you shouldn't have done it, you did it, now you committed an avera, a sin, and you're going to be liable to bring a sin offering for that. If you did it unintentionally. If you did it intentionally, you have a whole other set of problems. But then once you did it, you rendered that object, that part of the offering, non-sacred. Whereas with the peace offerings, the only parts of the peace offering that are subject to this particular law of misuse are the parts that go up on the altar. The burnt offering, all of it goes up on the altar. The peace offering, only a part of it. So the horns don't go up on the altar, and therefore, if you misuse them, you haven't turned them into something non-sacred, and therefore you've got this problem that you never should have used that shofar, and even after you used it, you have not fulfilled your obligation. Now, Rava strongly objects to this argument. When does he commit misuse? After he has sounded it, for only then has he misused the consecrated animal. Now, you're already wondering, if you're paying attention closely, It says for mundane purposes. And the example I gave was the bull pulling the plow. But if you're using the horn of the animal to blow a shofar blast, is that a mundane purpose? Isn't that a sacred purpose? Maybe so, but not the purpose of an animal that was consecrated as a sacrifice. Okay, so Rava is saying, when does he commit the misuse? After he sounded it, for only then he misused the consecrated animal. If so, when he sounds it, he is sounding with something that is still prohibited, even in the case of the animal that was consecrated as a burnt offering, and so he should not be able to fulfill his obligation with it. So Rava's objection isn't that it's a problem that he can't fulfill his obligation with the horn from a peace offering. Rav is objecting to the idea that the horn from the burnt offering, he shouldn't have done it, but if he did it, he has fulfilled his obligation. Rav says, no, he didn't fulfill his obligation. Just like the horn of the peace offering, this was subject to misuse, and you cannot say you fulfill your obligation to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana with the horn of a consecrated animal. Rather, Rava said both this one, the shofar of a burnt offering, and the other one, the shofar of a peace offering, are governed by the same law. If he sounded them, he has not fulfilled his obligation. But later, Rava retracted his statement, and then he said the opposite. He said both this one, the shofar of the burnt offering, and the other one, the shofar of the peace offering, are governed by the same halacha, the same law. And if he sounded them, he has fulfilled his obligation. And the reason for this is that mitzvahs were not given for benefit. That is to say, the fulfillment of a mitzvah is not in itself considered a benefit, and in the absence of benefit, one is not liable for misuse. If you use that bull that was consecrated to be an offering in the temple to pull your plow and farm your land, okay, you definitely benefited from that bull, and so you have committed misuse of a consecrated object. But if you use that horn to hear a shofar blast, if you use it to perform a mitzvah, that is technically not considered a benefit. Now, obviously, we believe that when we perform mitzvahs, we benefit from that. We'll receive a reward eventually, right? We're going to be rewarded for all the mitzvahs we perform. We're going to be held accountable for all the sins that we committed. And living a righteous life in consonance with God's will and, fulfilling our obligations, that would seem very beneficial. That's a good thing to do. But from a halakhic Jewish legal point of view, if you use an object to perform a mitzvah, that is not considered a benefit because the mitzvahs weren't given for our benefit. They were given because we're called to serve God, right? We may benefit from a life of service, but technically speaking, the mitzvahs were not given for benefit. That is a phrase that comes up many times in the Talmud. Rav Yehuda said further, one should not sound a shofar that was used for idol worship. But if he nevertheless transgressed and sounded it, he has fulfilled his obligation. And one should also not sound a shofar from a city whose residents were incited to idolatry, where the majority of inhabitants committed idolatry. But if he nevertheless transgressed and sounded that shofar, then he has not fulfilled his obligation, right? So a shofar that was in some way used for idolatry, to worship an idol, you should not blow the shofar with it. But if you did blow the shofar with it, you have fulfilled your obligation. But a shofar that was used, where was it? It was used by a city. No, it's from a city. It was from a city. It was owned by somebody in a city where more than half of the residents committed idolatry. They were enticed to commit idolatry, and more than half of the residents engaged in idolatry. That shofar, you shouldn't use it, and if you did use it, you have not fulfilled your obligation. So what is the difference between a shofar that was itself used for idolatry and a shofar that comes from a city where more than half of the people were enticed to commit idolatry? What is the difference? With regard to any object found in a city whose residents were incited to idolatry, its size, as required for the mitzvah, is viewed by halacha, by Jewish law, as crushed into powder. Since a shofar from a city whose residents were incited to idolatry is destined for burning, it is considered as if it is already burnt, and it therefore lacks the requisite measurement for fulfilling the mitzvah. It's considered like it was powdered and destroyed, and that shofar, technically speaking, is smaller than the minimum size shofar, and therefore you cannot fulfill your obligation with it. Rava said, if one is prohibited by vow from deriving benefit from another person, i.e., if he took a vow not to receive any benefit whatsoever from a certain person, that other person is nevertheless permitted to sound a blast for him, so that he fulfills the mitzvah, in accordance with the principle that the fulfillment of a mitzvah is not in itself considered a benefit. For the same reason, if one is prohibited by vow from deriving benefit from a particular shofar, he is nevertheless permitted to sound a blast with it so that he may fulfill the mitzvah. And Rava also said, if one is prohibited by vow from deriving benefit from another person, that other person may nevertheless sprinkle the waters of purification on him, i.e., water mixed with the ashes of the red heifer, which was used to purify people and objects that had contracted ritual impurity, tuma, through contact with a human corpse. In the rainy season is when you can't do that, right? Is when you can do that, right? So we're riffing on this idea that the commandments were not given for benefit. So even if I vowed never to receive benefit from that person or not to receive benefit from that person for a year, and during that year, can that person sprinkle the waters of purification on me? We don't have this anymore. But when the temple was standing and we had the ashes of the red heifer available and they were mixed with the water to form the waters of purification, you would sprinkle that on a person who had come into contact with a human corpse with a hyssop branch. Why does that matter? Because a person who is tameh cannot enter the temple. So before you enter the temple, you have to go through the process of purification. The strongest impurities from touching a human corpse. You would have to be sprinkled on the 3rd and 7th day, and then immerse in a mikveh, and then wait nightfall, and then you could enter the temple. So, if I vowed never to benefit from that person, can he sprinkle those waters on me? Depends. In the rainy season, yes. In the dry season, no. Can you see why? Because I vowed not to benefit from that person. If he's sprinkling water on me, it's like he's cooling me down in the heat of summer. But if it's in the rainy season when it's cold and wet anyway, it's not like I desire to have the water on me. All he's doing for me is purifying me. And even though that is a big benefit to me if I want to enter the temple, the fact of a purification, which is a commandment in the Torah, that is not given for benefit, and so I can still receive that sprinkling from this person as long as I don't have any side benefit like being cooled down in the dry, hot summer months. It is related that the following ruling was sent from the land of Israel to Shmuel's father. The sage Shmuel was sent to his father, who was also a sage. If one was forcibly compelled to eat matzah on Passover, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara clarifies the matter. Who compelled him to eat the matzah? If we say, okay, so where we're going to, we're on a new subject now, and just to clarify, now we're talking about kavanah, about intention, right? Did you intend to fulfill the mitzvah, or did you accidentally perform the mitzvah? Now that we're on the subject of benefiting from mitzvahs. So if you intentionally intended to perform the mitzvah, obviously you fulfilled your obligation to do so. But if you did it accidentally, the sages are going to be split on whether or not you fulfilled your obligation. So the following ruling was sent from Shmuel to Shmuel's father from the land of Israel, so sent to Babylonia, to the Jewish community in Babel. If one was forcibly compelled to eat matzah on Passover, he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, the Gemara clarifies the matter. Who compelled him to eat the matzah? If we say that a demon forced him, i.e., that he ate it in a moment of insanity, this is difficult. Now, before we go any further, isn't that interesting? There's a lot of demonology, not a lot, but I mean, it comes up from time to time in the Babylonian Talmud, much less in the Jerusalem Talmud. And often we're talking about demons as, real creatures, And for instance, there's a classic teaching, you don't enter a ruin alone because demons hang out there. And one who enters alone is vulnerable to attack from the demons. But if two enter, we are not concerned. Here, it's like we have, kind of a clear reference to the idea that demons, either they're not real and it's really just a euphemism for insanity, or they're real and the way that they attack you is that they cause you to act insane. Okay. So if we say that a demon forced him to eat the matzah, i.e. that he ate in a moment of insanity, well, this is a difficult ruling because isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to someone who is at times sane and at times insane? During the times that he is sane, he is considered halachically, Jewish legally competent for all purposes and is obligated in all the mitzvahs. But when he is insane, he is considered insane for all purposes and is therefore exempt from the mitzvahs. We don't require an insane we don't view an insane person as obligated in the mitzvahs because they don't know what they're doing. They can't conduct themselves according to their own will. If so, someone who is compelled by a demon to eat matzah is not considered obligated to perform the mitzvah at all. So if he's not obligated, how can he be considered to have fulfilled his obligation? Rav Ashi said, we are dealing with a case where the Persians compelled him to eat. It wasn't some demonic force. It wasn't some insane compulsion, right? He was conscious. He knows, but he didn't intend to eat the matzah by his own desire. Rather, the Persians compelled him. So now you see we're talking about the Babylonian community. Babylonia, during the time that the sages are living and teaching in the Talmud, is part of the Persian Empire. He says, we're dealing with a case where the Persians compelled him to eat. And Rava said, that is to say, that one who sounds a shofar for the music, having no intent to fulfill the mitzvah, fulfills his obligation, since the critical issue is hearing the blast and not the intent of the blower. Right? So what we're seeing here is, okay, maybe I didn't even know it was Passover. I forgot, but somebody said, here, eat this matzah. I ate the matzah. They forced me. They have power over me, right? They have police, military power over me. And they forced me to eat the matzah. It turned out that it was Passover. Did I fulfill my obligation? According to this view, yes. Likewise, if somebody didn't know that it was Rosh Hashana and he went to a concert, but in that concert, the orchestra used a shofar as an instrument, and I heard the clear shofar blast, did I fulfill my obligation to hear the shofar in Rosh Hashana? According to Rav Ashi, yes. The Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that this is identical to that which was stated above, that one who was compelled to eat matzah fulfills the mitzvah, even if he had no intention of doing so? Well, the same should apply in the case of the shofar, that one who heard the blast of a shofar, even in the context of music, nevertheless heard the shofar, and he fulfills his obligation, even if he had no intention of doing so. The Gemara answers, so aren't these the same ruling? Why do we need both rulings? Isn't it the same concept? And the Gemara answers, well, lest you say that there is a difference between the two cases, because there, the merciful one says, eat matzah. And he indeed ate it, thereby fulfilling the mitzvah. But here, with regard to the shofar, it is written, Leviticus 23:24, a memorial of blast, zikaron teruah. It's not just you shall hear the shofar, right? That mitzvah is amplified and it's written in the Torah. It is a memorial of blasts, which might have been understood as requiring a conscious intent. A memorial means you have to be remembering why you're hearing it. In this case, that God told you to hear it as a remembrance of all that the shofar represents. And this one was merely acting unawares, without having any intent whatsoever of performing the mitzvah. Therefore, Rava teaches us that the absence of intent does not invalidate fulfillment of the mitzvah, even in the case of the shofar. So the Gemara concludes, apparently, Rava maintains that the fulfillment of mitzvahs, the fulfillment of commandments, does not require intent. And that is to say, if one performs a mitzvah, he fulfills his obligation even if he had no intention of doing so. That is Rava's view. The Gemara raised an objection to this conclusion from what we learned in a Mishnah. If one was reading the passage of Shema in the Torah, and the time of reciting Shema arrived, if he focused his heart, he has fulfilled his obligation. But if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. And the Gemara reasons, what? Is it not that he focused his heart to fulfill his obligation? And if he didn't focus his heart, then he has not fulfilled his duty, therefore implying that the fulfillment of mitzvahs requires intent. So learning from the example of somebody who happened to be studying the Torah, and the passage of the Shema that we must recite morning and evening every day is contained in the Torah. And so he happened to be reading it at the time that he's required to say the Shema in the morning or in the evening. So if he read it and saying, okay, I'm reading it in the Torah, but now I'm reading it to fulfill my obligation, he fulfilled his obligation. But if he just read it, he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. So don't we learn from that the performance of mitzvahs requires intent? Now the Gemara rejects this argument. No, the Mishnah means that he intended to read the passage. And the Gemara asks in astonishment, to read, but he's already reading it. For the Mishnah explicitly states, if one was reading the Torah. And the Gemara answers, we are discussing one who was reading from a Torah scroll in order to correct it, uttering the words indistinctly. Meaning it's a Shofar, a scribe, who's just reading it along and making sure that all the letters are formed correctly in case one of them needs some kind of an adjustment. So he's not reading the Torah. He's not getting any meaning. So you see there's different levels of intention. If he's just kind of reading it, but really for the purpose of seeing if the letters are formed correctly, that you definitely haven't fulfilled your intention to say the Shema. If you're reading it, as you're reading the Torah, you're reading scripture, the way people read scripture, and it happened to be at the time of reciting Shema, have you fulfilled your obligation or not? It would seem, yes, you have, but we still haven't proven whether you need intent to fulfill a mitzvah or not. The Gemara raises another objection. Come in here, that which we learned in our Mishnah. If one was passing behind the synagogue, or his house was adjacent to the synagogue, and he heard the sound of the shofar, or the sound of the scroll of Esther being read on Purim, the Megillah. If this person focused his heart, then he has fulfilled his obligation. But if not, he has not fulfilled his obligation. Now what? Is it not that he focused his heart to fulfill his obligation? And if he failed to do so, he has not fulfilled his duty, therefore implying that the fulfillment of mitzvahs requires specific intent to be fulfilling your obligation. The Gemara rejects this argument. No, the Mishnah means that he intended to hear the sound of the shofar. The Gemara immediately asks, what do you mean, to hear? But he already hears it. The Mishnah explicitly said, and he heard the sound of the shofar. And the Gemara answers, we are discussing one who thinks that it is merely the sound of a donkey that he is hearing. And in this case, where the listener thinks that the sound was not that of a shofar, he does not fulfill his obligation. Therefore, the Mishnah teaches that it is sufficient that one have intent and know that he is hearing the sound of a shofar. Right? Again, you're listening to this sound if you know that it is a shofar. So you're at that point you're intending to hear the shofar. You don't know, let's say you didn't know it was Rosh Hashana, so you didn't know that you're obligated to hear the shofar on that day. You're still going to be yotze. You're going to be considered as if you fulfilled your obligation because you know you're hearing a shofar. But if you heard this sound and it was kind of far away and indistinct, and you didn't know what it was, you thought maybe it was an interesting car horn, then you did not fulfill your obligation to hear the shofar. The Gemara raised an objection to this answer from a baraisa. If the hearer of the shofar had intent, but the sounder, the one blasting the shofar, did not have intent, or if the blaster of the shofar had intent, but the hearer, the one listening to it, did not have intent, he has not fulfilled his obligation until both the one who hears and the one who blasts have intent to fulfill the mitzvah. Granted, with regard to the case where the blaster had intent, but the listener did not have intent, Rava can say that this is referring to a case where the listener thinks that it is merely the sound of a donkey, and he did not have intent to hear the sound of a shofar. But with regard to the case where the listener had intent, but the blaster did not have intent, under what circumstances can this case be found? Is it not where the blaster sounds the shofar for the purpose of making music? And despite the intent of the listener, he has not fulfilled his obligation. And this implies that unless the blaster of the shofar has intent to fulfill the mitzvah, the listener does not fulfill his obligation. And the Gemara rejects this argument. Perhaps the Baraisa is referring to a case where he sounded bark-like blasts with the shofar, i.e., he did not sound the shofar in the proper manner, but merely acted unawares without intent to perform the mitzvah. And the Baraisa teaches us that if he has intent to sound the blast in the correct manner, he has fulfilled his obligation, even if he doesn't know that it's Rosh Hashana and that one is obligated to blast and to hear the shofar on that day, as long as it is a proper shofar sound. Abaye said to Rava, so these has all been the views of Rava. Now Abaye says to Rava, however, if that is so, that the fulfillment of a mitzvah does not require intent, all right, so if we take your argument at face value, that we don't have to have intent to fulfill our obligation, one who sleeps in a sukkah on the 8th day of assembly, on Shmini Atzeret, should receive lashes for violating the prohibition against adding to mitzvahs, since he is adding to the mitzvah of you shall dwell in Sukkot, in sukkahs, for 7 days. Leviticus 23:42. Now, according to Rava, even if one did not intend to observe the mitzvah of sukkah, but he slept in the sukkah for a different reason, his sleeping in the sukkah constitutes the fulfillment of a mitzvah to dwell there. Then, if one did so at an inappropriate time, after Sukkot ends and we enter the 8th day, which is Shmini Atzeret, a separate holiday where we are not obligated to dwell in the sukkah, then if one did so at an inappropriate time, so he is considered to have transgressed the prohibition against adding to the mitzvahs, right? We don't make up mitzvahs. We've seen that there are rabbinic decrees which are designed to draw a fence around the Torah and to protect us from coming to inadvertently transgress mitzvahs. But we don't create mitzvahs. And dwelling in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeret is not a mitzvah. Yet the sages instituted, wait a minute, where am I? Then if one did so at an inappropriate time, he's considered to have transgressed the prohibition against adding to the mitzvahs. Yet the sages instituted that in the diaspora, outside of Israel, one must observe Sukkot for 8 days, right? Because we saw that the problem of the ambiguity of the calendar, when people didn't know whether the first day of Tishrei had to happen on Tuesday or on Wednesday, because the word couldn't get out quickly enough, and that's why we have 2-day Chag, 2-day Yom Tov, right? 2-day festivals outside of Israel. What that leads to is that it's still Sukkot on the 8th day, isn't it? Right? That's the issue. And Rava said because of uncertainty. Now Rava said to him, this is because I say that mitzvahs can be transgressed only by adding to them during their prescribed times. But if one adds to a mitzvah outside the period of obligation for the mitzvah, there is no violation of the prohibition against adding to the mitzvahs. On the 8th day of assembly, on Shmini Atzeret, there is no longer a mitzvah to sleep in the sukkah. Therefore, sleeping in the sukkah on that day does not constitute a prohibited act. It is nothing. One doesn't fulfill an obligation by doing it, but one doesn't transgress the prohibition against adding to the mitzvahs. You're just sleeping in an outdoor hut. You haven't done anything wrong. According to Rav Shemen bar Abba raised an objection. By the way, I'm coming to the end, so if you have questions or comments, get them in. Rav Shemen bar Abba raised an objection from that which was taught in a Baraisa. From where is it derived that a priest who went up to the platform to recite the priestly blessing should not say, since the Torah granted me permission to bless the Jewish people, I will add a blessing of my own. This is like adding to the mitzvahs in a prohibited way, which is not part of the priestly blessing that is stated in the Torah. For example, if the priest, who is supposed to get up there and say, right, the priestly blessing, right, he goes like this, and he says, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord countenance you and be gracious to you. May the Lord favor you and grant you shalom. That's the Kohanic, the priestly blessing. If while he's up there, he says, well, now that I'm a priest and I'm standing here blessing you, I'm going to add my own blessings. Like, for example, if the priest says to the people, may the Lord God of your fathers make you 1,000 times as many as you are. Now, that's actually a verse from the Torah. It's not like it's even his own original thought. He's adding a blessing that Moses gave the Jewish people. So if he adds that when he's standing on the platform blessing the Jewish people on Rosh Hashana in the temple, what's so bad about that? But he's not allowed to do that. And it is derived from the verse that states, you shall not add to the word which I command you, at Deuteronomy 4:2. But here, since the priest already recited the priestly blessing, the time of the mitzvah has passed. And according to Rava, after the prescribed time for performing the mitzvah, one does not transgress the prohibition against adding to mitzvahs, yet it nevertheless teaches that he has transgressed, right? Rava's argument was, well, you don't have to worry about somebody who dwells in the sukkah for an extra day because the time of being commanded to dwell in the sukkah has already ended. So if he now sleeps in the sukkah another day, he's not transgressing that prohibition. He's just sleeping in a hut outside. He's not doing anything wrong. But this example shows that, well, if the priest gets up there and he performs the priestly blessing, so then he finished. He performed the priestly blessing, and then he adds an additional blessing. Well, hasn't the time of performing the priestly blessing already passed? So the fact that he adds some other blessing, he hasn't done anything. He hasn't, in a prohibited way, augmented the blessing because the time of it already passed. But the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? With a case where he did not complete the fixed text of the blessing, but he added to it in the middle. He added extra words in the middle of the blessing. So now he added to the word of God in a prohibited way in the middle of it because its time had not yet passed. And the Gemara raises an objection. Isn't it taught explicitly in a parallel baraisa? If he completed the priestly blessing, the Gemara, and if he completed the priestly blessing, right? So it would seem that we're not talking about a case where he added extra words in the middle because the baraisa said if he completed it. The Gemara answers, the baraisa means that he completed one blessing, i.e. the first verse of the priestly blessing, but he still has two more to go, and if he added some extra words before he finished, then he has transgressed that prohibition. And the Gemara raises a further difficulty. Isn't it taught in another baraisa dealing with the same issue? If he completed all of his blessings. So it would seem if he added, even after completed all the blessings, that he still transgresses this prohibition. And the Gemara explains, here with regard to the priestly blessings, it is different. Since if he encounters another congregation, he may recite the blessings again, from which we learn that the entire day of a festival on which the priests give the blessing is the prescribed time of the mitzvah. Therefore, even if he added a blessing of his own only after he finished reciting all three verses of the priestly blessing, he is still considered to have added to the mitzvah in a prohibited way during the prescribed time of that mitzvah, and he therefore transgresses the prohibition against adding to mitzvahs. So where do we come out on the question of intention to perform a mitzvah? Is it required to have intent to perform a mitzvah in order to have fulfilled your obligation when you perform that mitzvah? In other words, if you accidentally ate matzah not knowing it was Passover, but it was Passover and you ate matzah, did you fulfill your intention? If you accidentally heard the shofar not knowing you needed to hear the shofar that day, did you fulfill your obligation? What is the law? The most prominent early authorities dispute this matter. Some say that the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rava and mitzvahs do not require intent. That includes Tosafos and Rabbeinu Yonah. Some say that the halacha does not follow Rava, but rather Rabbi Zera, and intent is required in order to fulfill one's obligation. And the Rosh and the Baal Halachot Gedolot subscribe to this view. It was subsequently determined that the halacha follows the second opinion. The mitzvahs do require intent. The opinion of most halachic decisors is that this ruling applies only to mitzvahs by Torah law, while mitzvahs by rabbinic decree do not require intent. So if it's a rabbinic decree and you fulfill it accidentally, you have fulfilled your obligation. But if it's a written Torah law, and there's some oral laws that are considered Torah law, and you did it accidentally, you have not fulfilled your obligation. So hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashana requires intent to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana. However, some say that there is no distinction and that all mitzvahs require intent, right? So the third view is even rabbinic decrees require intent, and the Vilna Gaon subscribes to this view, also known as the Gra. In any case, if one did not have the intent to fulfill a mitzvah, and he performs it again with intent, he says, oh man, I actually heard the shofar accidentally, but I didn't have intent. So then he performs it again with intent. When he does it the second time, he should take this first opinion, Rava's opinion, into account and refrain from reciting a blessing. You do need intent to fulfill your obligation, but, and when we perform a mitzvah, usually we say a blessing over performing the mitzvah. So if you fulfilled it accidentally, or if you did it accidentally, and according to Rava's view, you have fulfilled your obligation. But because most halakhic decisors agree that you need intent, so you perform it again with intent. But the second time you did it with intent, after the first accidental time, you don't recite the blessing in case Rava's view is correct, so that you shouldn't recite a blessing in vain. That's important. Sometimes in the morning, you're not sure if you washed your hands or not. And you're not sure if you uttered the blessing or not. So then you go back and wash your hands again, that negelwasser, that first morning washing of the hands. And you're not sure if you said the blessing the first time. You're not even sure if you did it the first time. So that second time, you wash your hands to make sure you've washed your hands. But you don't recite the blessing because it's worse to recite a blessing in vain. Okay, let's go to questions and comments. Sharon, can anyone administer the purification ritual? I thought it had to be a Kohen. That's a great question. So I'm not sure. I can't remember offhand. But it could still apply in terms of the teaching we had tonight, that you might have vowed never to receive benefit from that particular person, and he is a Kohen. And so the teaching would stand as we learned it tonight. And I can't remember if a non-Kohen can perform the sprinkling, right? So that you can enter the temple. Did we cover that topic? I'm not even sure. It's a great question, Sharon. I'm not sure what the answer is. Lucy, about the city where more than half of the people are idolatrous. How about the non-idolatrous in there? Are their shofars no longer valid, or is the Talmud talking about a publicly owned or found shofar? You guys are great. Excellent question. I think the idea here is, so first of all, we're talking about a city in the Holy Land at the time that the Jews have sovereignty over that land, and the temple is standing, right? So then there's a commandment that if a city gets seduced to idolatry, and there it just means the majority of them, that city is going to be burned to the ground. There's probably a death penalty for all the idolaters as well, which would mean Jews, right? There's no death penalty. There's no penalty for non-Jews that commit idolatry. I'm not sure about that. I mean, it is definitely one of the laws of the Noahide laws that you don't commit idolatry. That's a commandment to all of mankind. But in terms of this specific law, that you would burn such a city to the ground and everything in it. And really what that's about is that in a military campaign against such a city, the Jewish soldiers can take no booty from that city. Standard practice in the ancient world that when you go to war, and you win the battle against some city, the spoils of war include some kind of, rewards, right? The financial, monetary rewards, the booty from that city. But if that's an idolatrous city, you can't take anything from it. All the objects in that city stand to be burned. Did the non-idolaters in that city leave with their property? I don't know. That's a whole bunch of interesting questions that go along with it. But for our purposes here, all we're saying is that a shofar in such a place that stands to be burned, even now before it's burned, cannot be used to fulfill one's obligation to hear the shofar on Rosh Hashana. And finally, Sharon, what was the standard for insanity? Who determined mental health competency back then? What, am I going to have a quick answer to such a question? That's a deep and extensive question. I can't even remember from my last journey through the Talmud if we're going to examine that, but I do believe we will, and I think it'll be in Tractate Sanhedrin, where all kinds of laws of court procedure, criminal procedure, civil procedure, are going to be handled, including how we adjure the witnesses. Now, are they going to have extensive, rules and case law about what is considered a person who's unable to conduct himself according to his own will or conduct himself according to the law because of problems of insanity? It's not going to be as clearly defined as it's going to be in U.S. law. There's going to be a lot more, I'm sure, discretion in the hands of the judge. Nevertheless, there's certainly going to be principles that the judge is going to be guided by in determining whether a person is fit to stand trial, whether a person is obligated in mitzvahs or suffering from this spirit of insanity. And what's interesting is we have already established that there's something called temporary insanity, right? That we saw tonight. People who will go in and out of a state of insanity. Here we're only talking about whether they are obligated in the commandments while they are insane. Criminal culpability is a whole other question, and we have not touched on that yet. We will later in our journey. That's what I've got for us tonight. Please recall, no class tomorrow, Sunday night. It's going to be a terrible day. That tragedy that happened last week, the funeral is tomorrow, and other matters are happening tomorrow. So with God's help, we'll resume class on Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, and we'll do a double daf, pages 29 and 30, with God's help on Monday night. Have a great week.